The workers froze the instant the shovel struck something solid. It was March of 1847, and a renovation crew working on the Delqua estate outside New Orleans had already uncovered 3 small wooden boxes buried beneath what had once been the slave quarters. Each box held the same unsettling contents, dozens of tiny cloth bundles, carefully wrapped and deliberately preserved. Inside every bundle was a single human tooth. By the time local authorities were summoned, 17 more boxes had been pulled from the same patch of earth. Every one followed the same meticulous pattern. The Delqua family insisted they knew nothing about the burials, yet municipal records told a far more troubling story. Between 1791 and 1823, more than 40 enslaved people connected to the estate had disappeared without any record of sale, death, or transfer. No paperwork, no explanations. The boxes were quickly removed. The discovery was quietly suppressed by influential families with long-standing ties to the property. No formal investigation followed, and for decades the incident slipped into silence. But the contents of the final boxes pointed to something far more disturbing than simple neglect or lost records. They suggested a practice so deliberate, so coldly systematic, that it forced historians to reconsider what they believed about power, punishment, and control in antebellum Louisiana. Before we continue with the story of the Delqua estate and the revelation that sent shockwaves through New Orleans society, I want to ask you something. If you're drawn to dark historical mysteries that exist in the uneasy space between documented fact and buried truth, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. And leave a comment telling us what city or state you're listening from. We love knowing where a community of mystery seekers is discovering these stories. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those slave quarters and why the truth was buried for so long. The discovery at the Delqua estate didn't happen in isolation. It emerged from a city already thick with secrets where the old French and Spanish colonial powers had left layers of tradition, cruelty, and silence that the newer American administration struggled to penetrate. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of contradictions, a place where 3 cultures, French, Spanish, and American, collided and merged into something entirely unique. The air hung heavy with humidity even in March, and the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the less pleasant odor of the docks, where ships from across the world unloaded cargo, both inanimate and human. The Mississippi River, swollen with spring rains, flowed past the city like a brown serpent, carrying with it the commerce and secrets of half a continent. The city had been American territory for over 4 decades, purchased from Napoleon in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase, but its soul remained distinctly Creole. French was still spoken as commonly as English in the markets and drawing rooms. Spanish architectural influences dominated the older quarters with their wrought iron balconies and hidden courtyards. And beneath it all, the rhythms and traditions of Africa and the Caribbean pulsed through the city's veins, brought by enslaved people who'd been torn from their homelands and forced to build a new world for their masters. The Delqua estate sat on the northern edge of what locals were beginning to call the Garden District. Though in 1847 that area was still being developed by wealthy Americans who'd made their fortunes in cotton, sugar, and the slave trade itself. The main house was a sprawling structure of white columns and wide galleries built in 1789 by Jean-Baptiste Delqua, a French merchant who fled Sandaing during the early tremors of what would become the Haitian Revolution. Jean-Baptiste had been a shrewd man, according to the records that survived him. He'd seen the writing on the wall in Sandaing earlier than most of his fellow colonists, and he'd managed to escape with a substantial portion of his wealth intact, along with 12 enslaved people who'd been forced to accompany him into exile. In New Orleans, he'd used that wealth to purchase land and establish himself as a sugar planter, though his operation was smaller than the massive plantations that dominated the areas south of the city. The slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins behind the main house, had housed anywhere from 30 to 60 enslaved people over the decades, depending on the family's fortunes and the demands of the sugar harvest. The cabins were simple structures, each about 12 feet square, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked during the frequent rainstorms. In winter, cold air seeped through the gaps between the boards. In summer, the interiors became ovens, trapping heat and humidity until breathing itself became an effort. By 1847, the estate had passed to Jean-Baptiste's grandson, Christophe Decoy, a man in his early 52nds who'd inherited not just property but a reputation. Christophe was known throughout New Orleans society as a man of culture and refinement. He spoke fluent French, Spanish, and English. He traveled to Paris twice and maintained correspondence with intellectuals in France. He collected books, patronized local artists, and hosted salons where the city's elite gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, and politics. His wife, Margot, was the daughter of a prominent Creole family, the Beaumonts, who could trace their lineage back to the earliest French settlers of Louisiana. She was known for her elaborate soirees, events that could last until dawn, and featured the finest food, wine, and entertainment. It meant that New Orleans had to offer. Their 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, attended the finest schools and were being groomed to take their places among the city's aristocracy. To the outside world, the Delqua family represented the best of New Orleans society, cultured, prosperous, and respectable. But those who worked closely with the family, the house servants who saw them in their private moments, the vendors who delivered goods to the estate, the neighbors whose properties adjoined theirs, spoke in whispers of something else. The Delqua estate had an unusually high turnover of enslaved workers. People would arrive, purchased at the slave markets on Chartres Street, or brought in from other plantations, work for a period of months or sometimes years, and then simply disappear from the property. When questioned, the family would provide vague explanations, sold to a plantation upriver, sent to work in the household of a relative in Mobile, died of fever, and buried in the poppers field outside the city. These explanations were accepted because they were common. Enslaved people were property, and property changed hands frequently. Disease was rampant in New Orleans, particularly during the summer months when yellow fever swept through the city with devastating regularity. Death was so common that it barely warranted comment. But there were inconsistencies that troubled those who paid attention. Bills of sale that should have existed for transferred enslaved people couldn't be found. Death certificates that should have been filed with the city were missing. And sometimes people who'd supposedly been sold to plantations upriver would be spotted months later in New Orleans working for different masters with no memory of ever leaving the city, or with memories so fragmented and confused that they couldn't provide a coherent account of what had happened to them.
One person who'd noticed these inconsistencies was Father Antoine Blanc,
a Catholic priest who served the French-speaking community in New Orleans. Father Blanc had been hearing confessions and providing spiritual guidance to both free and enslaved people for over 20 years, and he developed a reputation as a man who genuinely cared about the souls in his care, regardless of their social status. In the spring of 1846, a year before the boxes would be discovered, Father Blanc had been approached by an elderly enslaved woman named Josephine, who worked in the Delacroix household. Josephine had been with the family for over 30 years, having been purchased by Jean-Baptiste himself in the 1810s. She was one of the few enslaved people who'd remained on the property for an extended period, and she'd seen dozens of others come and go. Josephine told Father Blanc a disturbing story. She claimed that Jean-Baptiste Decoy had practiced a form of control over the enslaved people on his property that went beyond the usual brutalities of slavery. He'd extracted teeth from newly arrived enslaved people, telling them that as long as he held their teeth, they could never truly be free. The teeth, he'd claimed, contained their souls, their essence, and he would use them to track down anyone who tried to escape or to curse anyone who disobeyed him. Josephine herself had lost a tooth to John Baptiste's practice when she'd first arrived at the estate. She remembered the terror of that day, the way Jean-Baptiste had explained the ritual in his precise French, translated by an older enslaved man who'd been on the property for years. She remembered the pain of the extraction, performed without any form of anesthetic, and the way Jean-Baptiste had wrapped the tooth in cloth and placed it in a wooden box with dozens of others. For years, Josephine had believed absolutely in the power of the writ. She'd seen what happened to people who tried to escape. They were always caught, always returned, and she'd believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had used their teeth to track them down. She'd seen people who disobeyed suffer mysterious illnesses or accidents, and she'd believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had cursed them through their teeth. But as she'd grown older, as she'd seen Jean-Baptiste die and his son take over the estate, as she'd watched the practice gradually fade away, Josephine had begun to question, had the teeth really held power, or had it all been an elaborate trick, a way of exploiting the spiritual beliefs that many enslaved people had brought with them from Africa and the Caribbean? Father Blanc had listened to Josephine's story with growing horror. He'd heard rumors of similar practices on other plantations, whispers of psychological control that went beyond physical punishment, but he'd never encountered such a detailed account, and he'd never heard of anyone documenting the practice so systematically. He'd asked Josephine if she knew what had happened to the boxes of teeth after Jean-Baptiste's death. She told him that Jean-Baptiste's son, Christophe's father, whose name had also been Christophe, had been disturbed by the discovery of the boxes and had ordered them buried somewhere on the property. She didn't know exactly where, but she'd heard the house servants talking about a burial that had taken place late one night in 1824, shortly after the elder Christophe had found his father's journal describing the tooth extraction practice. Father Blanc had wanted to investigate further, but Josephine had begged him not to. She was terrified of what might happen if the Delacroix family discovered that she'd spoken to him. Despite her doubts about the power of the teeth, decades of conditioning had left her deeply afraid of the family's retribution. Father Blanc had reluctantly agreed to keep her confidence, but he'd made notes about their conversation in his personal journal. Those notes would later prove crucial to understanding the full scope of what had happened at the Delacroix estate. The renovation in March 1847 was meant to modernize the slave quarters and expand the estate's capacity. Christophe Diacqua had recently purchased 15 additional enslaved people at auction, and he needed more housing for them. He'd hired a crew of Irish immigrants, men who'd fled the Great Famine and were willing to work for low wages to tear down 2 of the older cabins and build new structures with brick foundations instead of the rotting wooden posts that had supported the original buildings. The foreman of the crew was a man named Patrick Brennan, a 35-year-old from County Cork, who had arrived in New Orleans just 6 months earlier with his wife and 3 children. Brennan had been a tenant farmer in Ireland, and he'd watched his neighbors starve as the potato blight destroyed crop after crop. He'd sold everything he owned to pay for passage to America, believing the promises of opportunity and prosperity that immigration agents had spread throughout Ireland. The reality of life in New Orleans had been harsher than Brennan had expected. The Irish immigrants were relegated to the most dangerous and degrading work, digging canals through swamps filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, loading and unloading cargo on the docks, and taking on construction jobs that even enslaved people weren't forced to do because the risk of death or injury was too high. If an enslaved person died, the master lost valuable property. If an Irish immigrant died, he could simply be replaced by another desperate arrival from the next ship. But Brennan was a survivor. He'd learned quickly, worked hard, and managed to establish himself as a reliable foreman. The job at the Delacroix estate was a good one by his standards. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and Christophe Diacqua had a reputation for treating his workers fairly, at least by the standards of the time. Brennan had assembled a crew of 6 men, all Irish immigrants like himself, all desperate for work. Among them was a young man named Seamus Corian, barely 20 years old, who'd lost his entire family to the famine and had arrived in New Orleans alone and penniless. There was also Michael O'Brien, a former stonemason who'd worked on churches and manor houses in Ireland before the famine had destroyed his livelihood. And there was Thomas Murphy, a quiet man in his 42nds who rarely spoke about his past, but who worked with a grim determination that suggested he was trying to outrun painful memories. The crew had started work on a Monday morning in early March. The weather was mild with a light breeze coming off the river, and the work had progressed smoothly for the first few days. They'd torn down the first cabin without incident, hauling away the rotted wood and clearing the site for the new foundation. It was on Thursday, March 11th, that they'd begun digging the foundation trench for the first new building. The soil was soft and easy to work, a mixture of clay and sand that was typical of the area. They'd been digging for about an hour, reaching a depth of roughly 3 feet, when Seamus Corian's shovel struck something solid. "Stone," Corian had muttered, expecting to find a rock or perhaps an old tree root. But when he'd cleared away the soil, he'd found instead a wooden box roughly 2 feet long and a foot wide with a flat lid secured by rusted nails. Brennan had come over to investigate, and the other workers had gathered around curious about what they'd found. Brennan later testified that his first thought was treasure, perhaps coins or jewelry hidden by some. E1 decades earlier. New Orleans was full of stories about buried treasure, about pirates and smugglers who'd hidden their loot in the swamps and forests around the city. Finding a buried box seemed like the kind of lucky break that could change a man's life. He'd pried open the lid with a crowbar, and the men had gathered around to see what was inside. The box contained no treasure. Instead, it held dozens of small cloth bundles, each one tied with twine that had darkened with age. The bundles were arranged in neat rows packed tightly together. Brennan had opened one of the bundles carefully, his hands shaking slightly with anticipation. Inside was a single human tooth, a molar by the look of it, with the root still attached. The tooth was yellowed with age, and there were dark stains on the root that might have been dried blood. Brennan had stared at the tooth for a long moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he'd opened another bundle, another tooth, and another. Every bundle in the box contained a single tooth, each one carefully wrapped and preserved. The men had stood in silence, staring at the contents of the box. The discovery was so unexpected, so inexplicable, that none of them knew how to react. Then Seamus Corian had pointed to the ground a few feet away. "There's another one," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. They dug more carefully this time and found a second box identical to the first. It, too, contained cloth-wrapped teeth. By the end of that first day, they'd found 5 boxes, all buried at roughly the same depth, all containing the same thing. Brennan had reported the discovery to Christophe Delacroix that evening. He'd found Delacroix in his study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Delacroix had been reading when Brennan knocked, and he'd looked up with mild annoyance at the interruption. "Boo!" When Brennan had explained what they'd found, Delacroix's expression had changed dramatically. The color had drained from his face, and his hands had begun to tremble. He'd asked Brennan to repeat himself, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Brennan had brought one of the boxes with him, and he'd placed it on Delacroix's desk. Delacroix had opened it slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were afraid of what he might find inside. When he'd seen the cloth-wrapped teeth, he'd closed his eyes and taken a deep breath. "Stop work immediately," Delacroix had said, his voice barely steady. "Send the men home. I'll pay them for the full day. Tell them not to speak of this to anyone. I'll contact the authorities in the morning." But Delacroix didn't contact the authorities. Instead, he'd spent that night in his study, going through old ledgers and documents that had been stored in the estate's archives for decades. His wife, Margot, had found him there at dawn, surrounded by papers, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and his face haggarded. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd told her only that there had been a disturbing discovery on the property and that he needed to understand its origins before involving outsiders. Margot had pressed him for details, but Christophe had refused to elaborate. He'd simply told her to keep the children away from the construction site and to ensure that the house servants didn't gossip about whatever they might have heard. The next day, Friday, March the 12th, Christophe Delacroix had instructed Patrick Brennan to continue the excavation, but to do so carefully and document everything they found. He'd hired 2 additional workers and offered them extra pay for their discretion. He'd also brought in a clerk from his business office, a young man named Henri Dubois, to keep detailed records of the excavation. Dubois was a meticulous Record keeper and his notes from that week would later provide crucial evidence about the scope of the discovery. He documented the location of each box, its dimensions, its condition, and the number of teeth it contained. He'd also noted any distinguishing features, unusual markings on the boxes, variations in the cloth used to wrap the teeth, anything that might help identify when and why the boxes had been buried. Over the next week, the crew had unearthed a total of 22 boxes, all buried in the area directly beneath and around the old slave quarters. The boxes were arranged in a pattern that suggested they'd been buried systematically, not randomly. The oldest boxes, judging by the degree of decay, were closest to the original slave quarters that had been built in the 1790s. The newer ones, though still decades old, were buried slightly farther away toward the edge of the property. Each box contained between 30 and 60 cloth-wrapped teeth. Some of the teeth were clearly from adults, large murs, and in sizes that showed signs of wear from years of use. Others were from children, small and delicate, some so tiny that they must have come from infants or toddlers. A few of the bundles also contained small scraps of paper with markings that might have been names or dates, but the ink had faded beyond legibility, leaving only ghostly traces of what had once been written there. The boxes themselves showed varying degrees of age and decay. Some were made of cypress, a wood that resisted rot well in the damp Louisiana soil. Others were made of pine, which had deteriorated more quickly, with some boxes partially collapsed under the weight of the soil. The nails used to secure the lids were hand-forged, a detail that confirmed the boxes dated from the early 19th century or earlier, before machine-made nails became common. Brennan had kept a careful record of where each box was found, creating a rough map of the excavation site. He'd noticed that the boxes seemed to be arranged in rough rows, as if they'd been buried according to some system. The pattern suggested a deliberate organization, not the random burial of discarded objects. On the 8th day of excavation, Tuesday, March 16th, the crew made a discovery that would prove to be the key to understanding everything else. They'd been working near the foundation of the oldest cabin, the one that dated back to the 1790s, when they'd found a box that was different from the others. This box was larger, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, and made of a harder wood that had resisted decay better than the pine boxes they'd found previously. The wood appeared to be mahogany, an expensive material that suggested this box had been considered more important than the others. The lid was secured not just with nails, but with a small brass lock, though the lock had corroded over the decades and broke easily when Brennan applied pressure. Inside, along with the usual cloth-wrapped teeth, this box contained nearly 80 of them, was a leather-bound journal. The journal was in remarkably good condition, protected by the sealed box and the relatively dry soil. The leather cover was embossed with initials JBD. The pages were filled with neat handwriting in French, dated entries spanning from 1791 to 1823. Brennan couldn't read French, but he recognized the importance of the find. He brought the journal directly to Christophe Diacqua, who'd taken it without a word and disappeared into his study. He didn't emerge for the rest of the day. That night, Margot Delacqua had sent for the family physician, Dr. Henri Lavo, claiming her husband had taken ill. Dr. Lavo was a respected figure in New Orleans medical circles, a Creole physician who'd studied in Paris and who served many of the city's prominent families. He'd been the Delacqua family physician for over 15 years, and he delivered all 3 of Christophe's children. Dr. Lavo had arrived to find Christophe in a state of extreme agitation, pacing his study with the journal clutched in his hands. The doctor later testified that Christophe had been almost incoherent, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to explain what he'd discovered. He kept repeating, he documented everything. My God, he documented everything. Dr. Lavo had managed to calm Christophe enough to learn what had upset him so profoundly. The journal, Christophe explained, had been written by his grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Dequa. It was a meticulous record of a practice that Jean-Baptiste had implemented on the plantation, a system of control that went far beyond the usual brutalities of slavery. Dr. Lavo had asked to see the journal, and Christophe had handed it over with trembling hands. The doctor had read through several entries, his expression growing more disturbed with each page. The entries were written in a clear, precise hand with the detached tone of a man recording scientific observations rather than documenting acts of cruelty. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1791, just a few months after Jean-Baptiste had arrived in New Orleans from Saint-Denis. It read, "Today I have implemented a new method of ensuring compliance among the workers. Having observed the effectiveness of psychological control in Saint-Denis, I have adapted a practice that exploits the spiritual beliefs common among those brought from Africa and the Caribbean islands. Upon arrival, each worker will have a tooth extracted. The tooth will be preserved and stored, and the worker will be informed that their essence is now held by the Delacroix family. Should they attempt escape or prove disobedient, the tooth will be used to track them and ensure their return. The fear of spiritual bondage I have observed is often more effective than physical restraint." The entry continued with clinical details about the first extraction performed on a man named Baptiste, who'd been brought from Saint-Denis with Jean-Baptiste. The extraction had been done by a local physician whom Jean-Baptiste had paid handsomely for his discretion. The procedure had been performed without anesthetic, and Baptiste had been told that his tooth now contained his soul, which would remain in Jean-Baptiste's possession as long as he lived. Subsequent entries documented hundreds of similar extractions over the next 3 decades. Jean-Baptiste had kept meticulous records of each person who'd had a tooth extracted, their name, approximate age, where they'd come from, and the date of the extraction. He'd also noted their behavior after the extraction, documenting whether the psychological control had been effective. Most of the entries suggested that the practice had worked exactly as Jean-Baptiste had intended. People who'd had their teeth extracted rarely attempted escape, and when they did, they were often caught quickly, not because of any supernatural power, but because their fear of the supposed curse made them careless and easy to track. They believed they couldn't truly escape as long as Jean-Baptiste held their teeth, so they didn't plan their escapes carefully or travel far enough to avoid capture. But the journal revealed something even more disturbing than the extractions from living people. Jean-Baptiste had also documented what happened when enslaved people died on the property, whether from disease, accident, or the brutal conditions of their labor. He would have their bodies buried in unmarked graves in the far corner of the property, but not before extracting additional teeth. These teeth would be added to the boxes, ensuring that even in death, the enslaved remained under Delacroix control. Journal entries about post-mortem extractions were particularly chilling in their detachment. Marie, aged 24, succumbed to fever on July 18th. 3 teeth extracted before burial. Subject had been compliant throughout her service. Teeth stored in box 7. Jacques, age 16, died from injuries sustained in mill accident. 2 teeth extracted. Subject had shown signs of rebelliousness. Teeth stored in box 12 as warning to others. Dr. Lavo had read through dozens of these entries, feeling his stomach turn with each one. He'd known the Delacroix family for years, had attended their parties, had delivered their children, had considered Christophe a friend. The revelation that this practice had been carried out on the property, that the boxes of teeth represented decades of systematic psychological torture, was almost incomprehensible. But what disturbed Dr. Levo most was the realization that Jean-Baptiste's practice hadn't been unique. Scattered throughout the journal were references to other plantation owners who'd consulted with Jean-Baptiste about his methods. Some of these references were explicit, naming prominent Louisiana families and describing their interest in implementing similar practices on their own properties. Others were more circumspect, referring only to colleagues or associates who'd sought Jean-Baptiste's advice. One entry from 1803 read, "Received visit from Monsieur Beaumont regarding management techniques, explained the tooth extraction method and its psychological foundations. Monsieur Beaumont expressed interest in implementing similar practice on his property in Plaque, means parish, provided him with contact information for Dr. Rousseau, who was proven most reliable in performing the extractions." Another entry from 1811 read, "Correspondence from Monsieur Thibault requesting details of the tooth preservation method, explained the importance of proper wrapping and storage." To maintain the psychological effect, suggested he maintain detailed records as I have done to track effectiveness over time. These references suggested that the tooth extraction practice had spread beyond the Delacroix state, that it had become part of a network of psychological control employed by multiple plantation owners throughout Louisiana and possibly beyond. Christophe, his voice shaking, told Dr. Lavo that the journal contained over 300 entries documenting individual tooth extractions. 300 people who'd had their teeth extracted, their spirits claimed, their humanity reduced to a wrapped bundle in a buried box. And the practice hadn't ended with Jean-Baptiste's death in 1823. The journal's final entry suggested that he'd instructed his son, Christophe's father, to continue the tradition. Dr. Lavo had asked the obvious question. Had Christophe's father continued the practice? Had Christophe himself? Christophe's answer had been complicated. His father, he claimed, had been horrified by Jean-Baptiste's journal when he discovered it after the old man's death. The elder Christophe had found the journal in a locked drawer in Jean-Baptiste's desk, along with a letter instructing him to continue the tooth extraction practice and maintain the records. But instead of following his father's instructions, the elder Christophe had immediately stopped the practice. He'd refused to extract any more teeth, and he'd tried to destroy the evidence of what had been done. He'd burned some of the boxes, scattering the ashes in the river, but he'd been unable to bring himself to destroy all of them, perhaps out of some sense that the crimes they documented shouldn't be completely erased from history. And he'd been unable to destroy the journal itself, despite knowing that it was evidence of practices that would be condemned even by the standards of a slaveholding society. Instead, he'd ordered the remaining boxes and the journal buried on the property in 1824, late one night, when only a few trusted house servants were present. The location beneath the slave quarters had been chosen deliberately, a way of keeping the teeth close to the people they'd been taken from, even in death. Or perhaps Dr. Lavo thought it had been a form of penance, a way of acknowledging the suffering that had taken place there. Christophe himself, he insisted to Dr. Lavo, had known nothing until the renovation crew made their discovery. His father had never told him about Jean-Baptiste's practices, had never mentioned the buried boxes or the journal. Christophe had inherited the estate, the wealth, the social position, but not the knowledge of how that wealth had been built and maintained. Dr. Lavo had wanted to believe him. Christophe was his friend, a man he'd known for years, a man who'd always seemed decent and honorable by the standards of their society. But as he looked at the journal, at the meticulous records of suffering, he couldn't help but wonder how much had Christophe really known? How much had he chosen not to know? How much had he benefited from practices he claimed to find abhorrent? The discovery of the journal and the boxes created an immediate crisis for the Delacroix family. Dr. Lavo, despite his long friendship with Christophe, felt obligated to report what he'd learned to the authorities. Tooth extraction practice, even if it had ended decades earlier, represented a level of cruelty that demanded investigation. And the journal's references to other plantation owners suggested that the practice might have been more widespread than anyone had realized. But Christophe had begged Dr. Lavo to wait to give him time to understand the full scope of what his grandfather had done before the matter became public. He'd argued that rushing to involve the authorities would only create a scandal that would destroy his family without actually helping anyone. The people who'd suffered under Jean-Baptiste's practice were long dead, he'd said. What purpose would be served by dragging their suffering into the light now? Dr. Lavo had been torn. On one hand, he felt a moral obligation to report what he'd learned. On the other hand, he understood Christophe's concerns about scandal and the potential consequences for the Delacroix family. After much deliberation, he'd agreed to a delay of 1 week. In that time, Christophe would research his family's history and try to understand the full extent of Jean-Baptiste's practices. If at the end of that week, Christophe hadn't found a way to address the situation appropriately, Dr. Lavo would report the matter to the city authorities himself. Christoph had thrown himself into the research with desperate intensity. He'd spent every waking hour going through the estate's archives, examining every document related to his grandfather's time as master of the property. He'd found bills of sale for enslaved people, correspondence with other plantation owners, financial records detailing the estate's income and expenses over decades. What emerged from this research was a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond the tooth extractions. The Delqua estate had been one of the most profitable properties in the New Orleans area during the early 1800s, despite being smaller than many of the massive sugar plantations that dominated the region. Jean-Baptiste had achieved this profitability through a combination of efficient management and ruthless control. The tooth extraction ritual had been a key part of that control. By creating a psychological barrier to escape, Jean-Baptiste had been able to maintain a stable workforce without the constant losses that other plantation owners experienced. Enslaved people who believed they could never truly be free, even if they escaped, were less likely to try. And those who did try were often so paralyzed by fear of the supposed curse that they made mistakes that led to their capture. Christophe found letters from other plantation owners asking Jean-Baptiste about his methods and his remarkably low escape rate. Some of these letters were explicit about the tooth extraction practice, discussing its psychological impact and the spiritual beliefs that made it effective. Others were more circumspect, referring only to your innovative approach to management or the techniques you've pioneered that have proven so effective. One letter from 1807, written by a plantation owner named Etienne Beaumont, was particularly revealing. My dear Jean-Baptiste, I write to thank you for sharing your insights regarding the management of our workforce. I have implemented the tooth extraction practice on my own property following your guidance, and I must report that the results have been remarkable. Where previously I experienced frequent escape attempts and constant disciplinary problems, I now find my workers to be compliant and productive. The psychological effect of the ritual is profound. They truly believe that their essence is held captive, and this belief is more effective than any physical restraint. I have recommended your methods to several colleagues, and I believe you will be hearing from them soon. Your contribution to the science of management will, I am certain, be recognized as revolutionary. Christophe had found dozens of similar letters, all expressing gratitude for Jean-Baptiste's advice and reporting success with the tooth extraction practice. The implications were staggering. The practice hadn't been limited to the Delqua estate. It had spread quietly and deliberately among a network of plantation owners who saw it as a more efficient form of control than physical punishment alone. The teeth had become a currency of power, a way of claiming not just bodies but souls. And Jean-Baptiste had been at the center of this network, a pioneer of psychological warfare who'd shared his techniques with others and helped them implement similar practices on their own properties. Christophe also discovered financial records that showed his grandfather had been paid consulting fees by other plantation owners. These fees were substantial, sometimes as much as several hundred, a significant sum in the early 1800s. Jean-Baptiste hadn't just practiced psychological torture on his own property. He'd profited from teaching others how to do the same. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from a set of ledgers that documented the enslaved people who disappeared from the Delqua property over the years. The official story that they'd been sold or transferred to other properties was revealed to be largely false. Many of them had died on the property, their deaths unrecorded in any official document. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a section of the property that Jean-Baptiste referred to in his journal as the far field. Christophe decided to investigate this area, and he took Patrick Brennan and two of his workers to help him search. The far field was located at the edge of the property, separated from the main estate by a line of oak trees. It was an area that had never been cultivated, left as rough grassland that was occasionally used for grazing. They'd searched for several hours, probing the ground with long metal rods, looking for the soft spots that might indicate disturbed soil. They'd found 17 locations where the ground gave way more easily than the surrounding area, suggesting that something had been buried there. Christophe had ordered them to dig at one of these locations, and they'd found human remains buried about 4 feet down. The skeleton was small, possibly a child or young teenager, and there was no coffin or marker to indicate who the person had been. They'd rearied the remains and marked the location, but Christophe had decided not to excavate the other sites. He'd seen enough to confirm what Jean-Baptiste's journal had documented. Dozens of people had died on the property and been buried without ceremony or record. As Christophe dug deeper into his family's history, he began to notice something else. The family's wealth had declined significantly after 1823, the year Jean-Baptiste died, and the tooth extraction practice ended. The estate's financial records showed a clear pattern. During Jean-Baptiste's lifetime, the property had been highly profitable, generating substantial income from sugar production. But after his death, profits had declined steadily. The elder Christophe had struggled to maintain the estate's productivity. He'd experienced more escapes, more resistance, more management problems than his father ever had. Without the psychological control that the tooth extraction ritual provided, the enslaved people on the property had been more willing to resist to test the limits of their master's power. The profit margins had shrunk, and the family had been forced to sell off portions of the property to maintain their lifestyle. By the time the younger Christophe inherited the estate in 1839, it was a shadow of what it had been during Jean-Baptiste's time. The family was still wealthy by most standards, but they were no longer among the elite of New Orleans society. It was a damning correlation. The Delacroix fortune had been built on a specific form of terror, and when that terror ended, so did the prosperity. The tooth extraction practice hadn't just been a cruel eccentricity, it had been a fundamental part of the estate's economic model. Meanwhile, despite Christophe's attempt at secrecy, word of the discovery had begun to spread. The Irish workers, though paid for their discretion, had families and friends. Patrick Brennan had told his wife about the boxes, swearing her to secrecy. But she'd mentioned it to a neighbor who told someone else, and soon rumors were circulating through the Irish immigrant neighborhoods near the docks. The rumors were garbled and exaggerated, as rumors tend to be. Some people said that hundreds of bodies had been found buried beneath the Delacroix estate. Others claimed that the boxes contained not just teeth, but other body parts, fingers, toes, even hearts. A few whispered that the teeth had been used in voodoo rituals, that Jean-Baptiste Delacroix had been a practitioner of dark magic. These rumors eventually reached the French Quarter, where they spread through the markets and taverns, and from there they reached the ears of New Orleans' small but vocal abolitionist community, a group of free people of color, northern transplants, and a few sympathetic locals who opposed slavery on moral grounds. One of these abolitionists was a young lawyer named Thomas Wickham, who'd moved to New Orleans from Boston 3 years earlier. Wickham was 28 years old, idealistic, and convinced that slavery was not just economically inefficient, but morally indefensible. He'd come to New Orleans hoping to establish a legal practice that would help free people of color navigate the complex laws that govern their lives in a slaveholding society. Wickham had heard the rumors about the Delacroix estate, and he'd immediately recognized their significance. If the rumors were true, if a prominent New Orleans family had been systematically extracting teeth from enslaved people as a form of psychological control, it would be powerful evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty. It would be a story that could be used to sway public opinion to show people in the North, and even in the South, that slavery wasn't just about labor exploitation, but about comprehensive dehumanization. Wickham had begun investigating, asking questions, trying to separate fact from rumor. He'd spoken to some of the Irish workers who'd been involved in the excavation, and they'd confirmed that boxes containing teeth had indeed been found. He tried to speak to Christophe Delacroix directly, but his requests for a meeting had been refused. Finally, Wickham had gone to the city authorities, demanding to see the boxes and any other evidence that had been discovered. He'd argued that the boxes were evidence of crimes that demanded investigation, regardless of how long ago those crimes had been committed. The city authorities had been reluctant to get involved. New Orleans in 1847 was a city deeply invested in the institution of slavery. The city's economy depended on the labor of enslaved people and the trade in human beings. The city's elite were almost all slave owners or had close ties to slave-owning families. Investigating the Delacroix family would mean investigating practices that might implicate dozens of other prominent families. But Wickham had been persistent, and he'd found an ally in an unexpected place. Father Antoine Blanc, the Catholic priest who'd heard Josephine's confession the previous year. Father Blanc had been troubled by what Josephine had told him. And when he'd heard about the discovery of the boxes, he'd realized that her story had been true. Father Blanc had approached Wickham and shared what Josephine had told him, though he'd been careful not to reveal her identity. The priest's testimony had given Wickham's investigation new credibility, and the city authorities had finally agreed to examine the boxes and any other evidence that had been found. The pressure on Christophe Dequa intensified when an unexpected figure came forward, W.I. Information about the boxes. Her name was Celeste Thibault, and she was a free woman of color who worked as a seamstress in the French Quarter. She was in her late 62nd, and she claimed to have worked on the Delacroix estate as a young woman in the 1790s. Celeste's story, which she told to Thomas Wickham and later repeated in a sworn deposition, provided crucial context for understanding Jean-Baptiste's tooth extraction practice. She'd been born enslaved on a plantation in Saint-Dang and had been brought to New Orleans by Jean-Baptiste when she was about 12 years old. Shortly after he'd fled the island in 1791, she remembered the tooth extraction vividly, even though it had happened over 50 years earlier. The memory had never faded, she said, because the pain and terror of that day had marked her in ways that went beyond the physical. Jean-Baptiste had gathered all the newly arrived enslaved people. There had been about 15 of them, ranging in age from children to adults, in the courtyard of the estate. It had been a hot day in late summer, Celeste remembered, and the air had been thick with humidity. Mosquitoes had swarmed around them as they'd stood in the courtyard, uncertain about what was going to happen. Jean-Baptiste had explained through a translator who spoke both French and the Creole language that many of the Sandom refugees spoke what was about to happen. Each person would have a tooth removed. The tooth would be kept by the Delacroix family as a guarantee of good behavior. If anyone tried to escape, Jean-Baptiste had warned he would use the tooth to curse them, to ensure they were caught and returned. If anyone died, their tooth would keep their spirit bound to the estate, unable to find peace or join their ancestors. Celeste described the terror that the ritual had inspired. Many of the enslaved people, herself included, had grown up with spiritual traditions. That emphasized the importance of bodily integrity, the connection between physical remains and the soul. In the Vodou traditions that had been practiced in Saint-Dang, and which many enslaved people continued to practice in secret in Louisiana, physical objects could be used to influence or control a person's spirit. Hair, nail clippings, blood, all of these could be used in spiritual work for good or ill. The idea that part of them would be held captive, the Jean-Baptiste would have physical possession of something that contained their essence, was almost unbearable. It meant that even if they managed to escape, even if they made it to freedom in the North or in Mexico, they would never truly be free. Part of them would always be held by the Delacroix family, subject to their control and their curses. The extractions had been performed by a physician whom Jean-Baptiste had hired for the purpose. Celeste remembered him as a thin man with cold eyes who'd worked quickly, and without any apparent concern for the pain he was causing. He'd used a tool that looked like pliers to grip each tooth, and then twisted and pulled until the tooth came free. There had been no anesthetic, no preparation, just sudden searing pain. Celeste had been one of the last to have her tooth extracted that day. She'd watched the others go before her, had seen their faces contort with pain, had heard their cries and whimpers. By the time it was her turn, she'd been shaking with fear, and she'd had to be held down by two of Jean-Baptiste's overseers while the physician did his work. The pain had been worse than anything she'd experienced before. She'd felt the tooth crack as the physician twisted it, felt the root tear free from her jaw, felt the sudden gush of blood that had filled her mouth. She'd been given a cloth to bite down on afterward to help stop the bleeding, but the pain had lasted for days. Our jaw had swollen, and she'd had difficulty eating for over a week. But worse than the physical pain had been the psychological impact. For years afterward, Celeste had believed absolutely in the power of the extracted tooth. She'd been convinced that John Baptist could use it to track her, to curse her, to control her even from a distance. The belief had shaped every decision she'd made, every thought of resistance or escape. She'd seen what happened to people who tried to escape from the Delqua estate. They were always caught, always returned. And she'd believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had used their teeth to track them down. She'd seen people who disobeyed suffer mysterious illnesses or accidents. And she'd believed it was because Jean-Baptiste had cursed them through their teeth. But Celeste also revealed something that wasn't in Jean-Baptiste's journal: resistance. Not all of the enslaved people had accepted the power of the tooth ritual. Some, particularly those who'd been born in the Americas and had less connection to African spiritual traditions, had seen it as a cruel trick, a way of exploiting their beliefs for the master's benefit. There had been attempts to steal the boxes, to reclaim the teeth, and break the psychological hold they represented. Celeste knew of at least 3 such attempts during her time on the estate between 1791 and 1803, when she'd been freed. All had failed. Jean-Baptiste had kept the boxes locked in a secure room in the main house, and anyone caught trying to access them had been punished severely. One man, whose name Celeste remembered as Pierre, had managed to break into the room where the boxes were kept in 1797. He'd been caught before he could take any of the teeth, and Jean-Baptiste had made an example of him. Pierre had been whipped publicly in front of all the other enslaved people on the property and then sold to a Tra deer who specialized in supplying the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The message had been clear. Attempting to reclaim your tooth, attempting to break the spiritual hold that Jean-Baptiste claimed to have over you, would result in consequences far worse than simply accepting your bondage. Celeste herself had been freed by Jean-Baptiste in 1803 when she was about 24 years old. The freedom had come as a reward for years of loyal service, and she suspected because Jean-Baptiste had wanted to demonstrate his benevolence. He'd given her manumission papers and a small sum of money, enough to establish herself as a seamstress in New Orleans. She'd left the estate and built a life for herself in the city, never speaking publicly about her experiences until the discovery of the boxes brought the memories flooding back. She'd married, had children, and established a successful business. But she'd never forgotten the tooth extraction or the years of psychological bondage it had represented. Now, in 1847, Celeste was willing to speak publicly about what had happened. She'd heard the rumors about the discovery at the Delqua estate, and she'd realized that her testimony could help people understand the full horror of what Jean-Baptiste had done. She'd contacted Thomas Wickham and offered to tell her story. Wickham had recognized immediately that Celeste's testimony was crucial. She was a living witness to the tooth extraction practice, someone who could describe not just the physical process, but the psychological impact it had had on those who'd endured it. Her story would make the boxes of teeth more than just abstract evidence. It would give them a human face, a personal dimension that would be impossible to ignore. Celeste's testimony was powerful, but it also raised new questions. If Jean-Baptiste had kept the boxes in the main house, how had they ended up buried beneath the slave quarters? When had they been moved and why? Christophe Dequa, confronted with Celeste's testimony and pressed by both Wickham and the city authorities, finally admitted what he'd learned from his research into his family's papers. His father had found the boxes in Jean-Baptiste's journal after the old man's death in 1823. Horrified by what he'd discovered, the elder Christophe had ordered the boxes buried on the property in 1824. The burial had taken place late one night, with only a few trusted house servants present. The location beneath the slave quarters had been chosen deliberately, though Christophe wasn't entirely sure of his father's reasoning. Perhaps it had been a way of keeping the teeth close to the people they'd been taken from, a form of symbolic return, or perhaps it had been a way of hiding the evidence in a place where it was unlikely to be discovered. Who would think to dig beneath the slave quarters, structures that were considered temporary and disposable? The elder Christoph had also tried to destroy some of the evidence. He'd burned several boxes, scattering the ashes in the Mississippi River, but he'd been unable to bring himself to destroy all of them, and he'd been unable to destroy the journal. Instead, he'd buried them, perhaps hoping that they would eventually decay and disappear, erasing the evidence of his father's crimes. Thomas Wickham seized on these details. The burial, he argued, was evidence that the elder Christoph had known the tooth extraction practice was wrong, perhaps even criminal. By burying the boxes instead of destroying them completely, he tried to hide the evidence while maintaining some twisted form of connection to the past. Wickham demanded that the authorities conduct a full investigation. He wanted the boxes examined by medical experts, the TE. Analyzed to determine how many individuals they represented and how the extractions had been performed. He wanted the estate's records subpoenaed. Every document related to the enslaved people who'd lived and died there brought to light. Most importantly, he wanted the unmarked graves that Jean-Baptiste's journal mentioned located and properly identified. The Delacroix family resisted through their lawyers. They argued that the matter was a private family affair, that the practices described had taken place decades earlier under different laws and social norms, and the dredging up the past would serve no useful purpose. The enslaved people in question were long dead, they argued, and nothing could be done to help them now. Pursuing the investigation would only cause pain and scandal without achieving any meaningful justice. The legal battle dragged on through the spring and summer of 1847. Meanwhile, the boxes remained in the custody of the city, stored in a warehouse near the docks. Dr. Ari Lavo, who'd been asked by the city authorities to examine them, confirmed that they contained human teeth, hundreds of them, representing at least 200 individuals based on his count. But Dr. Lavo's examination revealed something else, something that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of Jean-Baptiste's practice. Some of the teeth showed signs of having been extracted post-mortem. The bone around the root socket had characteristics consistent with extraction after death, when blood was no longer flowing and tissue had begun to change. But many others showed signs of having been extracted from living subjects, and the extractions had been done crudely without regard for the pain or damage inflicted. Dr. Lavo's report described fractured roots, broken jawbone fragments still attached to some teeth, evidence of infection and disease that had developed after the extractions. The extractions hadn't been performed by a skilled dentist or physician using proper techniques. They'd been done by someone with minimal training, using force rather than skill. The goal hadn't been to remove the teeth safely or with minimal pain. It had been simply to extract them as quickly as possible, regardless of the suffering caused. This detail horrified even those who'd been inclined to view the tooth collection as a strange but relatively harmless eccentricity. The extractions had caused immense suffering, and that suffering had been inflicted deliberately as part of the ritual of control. The pain had been part of the point. It had reinforced the message that the enslaved people's bodies were not their own, that they could be violated at will, that their suffering was irrelevant compared to their master's desires. As the investigation continued through the summer of 1847, more people came forward with stories about the Delacroix estate and similar practices on other properties. Each new testimony added another layer to the emerging picture of systematic psychological control that had been employed alongside physical brutality. An elderly man named Augustus Porter, who'd been enslaved on a plantation in Plaquemines Parish south of New Orleans, testified that his former master had extracted one of his teeth when he was a teenager, telling him it was to keep him honest. The master had kept the tooth in a small box on his desk where Porter could see it every time he entered the house. The constant visual reminder of what had been taken from him, Porter said, had been almost as effective as physical chains in keeping him compliant. Porter had eventually escaped during the chaos of the War of 1812, when British forces had invaded Louisiana and the normal systems of control had broken down temporarily. He'd made his way north, eventually reaching Ohio, where he'd lived as a free man for over 3 decades. But he'd never forgotten the tooth extraction or the psychological hold it had represented. When he'd heard about the discovery at the Delqua estate, Pora had traveled back to Louisiana specifically to testify. He wanted people to understand, he said, that the tooth extraction practice wasn't just about physical pain or even about spiritual beliefs. It was about power, about masters finding new and more insidious ways to control people who were already completely under their power. A woman named Hannah Broussard, who'd purchased her freedom in the 1830s and now worked as a laundress in New Orleans, described a similar practice on the plantation where she'd been held in St. Charles Parish. The master there had kept a jar of teeth on his desk, visible to anyone who entered his office. It was a silent reminder of his power, a warning against disobedience that didn't require words. Hannah had never had her own tooth extracted. She'd been born on that plantation, and the master had apparently decided that the children of enslaved people who'd already been subjected to the ritual didn't need to undergo it themselves. But she'd grown up seeing that jar of teeth, knowing what it represented, and the psychological impact had been profound. A man named Benjamin Luron, a free person of color who worked as a carpenter in New Orleans, came forward with information about Dr. Etienne Rousseau, the physician whom Jean-Baptiste Journal had mentioned as performing the tooth extractions. Laurent's father had worked as Rousseau's assistant in the 1810s, and he told his son stories about the doctor's work. According to these stories, Rousseau had developed a technique for extracting teeth quickly and with minimal tools. He'd trained several other physicians in the method, and he'd made a substantial income from performing extractions for Plantation Owl. Throughout Louisiana, Rousseau had seen the work as a valuable service, Laurent said, a way of helping plantation owners maintain order and profitability. He'd never expressed any remorse for the pain he'd caused or the psychological torture he'd enabled. Rousseau had died in 1825, leaving behind no family and few personal effects, but Laurel's testimony suggested that the tooth extraction practice had been more widespread and more organized than anyone had initially realized. It hadn't been just Jean-Baptiste Dacquois' eccentric practice. It had been part of a broader system with trained practitioners and a network of plantation owners who employed it. These testimonies suggested that the tooth extraction practice had been more widespread than anyone had initially realized. It hadn't been unique to Jean-Baptiste Delacroix. It had been part of a broader culture of psychological control that some enslavers had employed alongside physical punishment. Thomas Wickham compiled these testimonies into a comprehensive report that he submitted to the City Council in July 1847, demanding action. He argued that the discovery of the boxes at the Delacroix estate was an opportunity to confront the full horror of slavery's mechanisms, to understand not just the physical brutality, but the psychological warfare that had been waged against enslaved people. Wickham's report was detailed and damning. It included Celeste Thibault's first-hand account of the tooth extraction ritual, Augustus Porter's testimony about similar practices on other plantations, Hannah Broussard's description of the jar of teeth used as a psychological weapon, and Benjamin Laurent's information about Dr. Rousseau's role in spreading the practice. The report also included excerpts from Jean-Baptiste's journal, carefully selected to illustrate the systematic nature of the practice and its psychological foundations. Wickham had obtained access to the journal through a court order over the strenuous objections of the Delacroix family's lawyers, but Wickham's efforts met with fierce resistance from New Orleans planter class. Many of them had family connections to the Delacroix family or had themselves employed similar practices. They saw Wickham's investigation as a threat to their own reputations and fortunes, and they mobilized to stop it. Anonymous letters appeared in the newspapers attacking Wickham as an outsider, a northern agitator trying to stir up trouble in a city that had its own ways of managing its affairs. Some letters questioned his motives, suggesting he was trying to make a name for himself by exploiting a tragedy. Others attacked his character, spreading rumors about his personal life and his legal practice. The attacks became more personal and more threatening as the summer progressed. Wickham received letters at his office warning him to drop his investigation or face consequences. One letter delivered in late August was particularly explicit. "Leave New Orleans, Yankee, or you'll end up in the river like so many others who didn't know when to mind their own business." Wickham reported the threats to the city authorities, but no investigation was launched. The message was clear. Powerful people wanted the matter buried, just like the boxes had been, and they were willing to use intimidation and possibly violence to achieve that goal. Wickham refused to be intimidated. He continued gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, building his case, but he also began to notice that he was being followed. Men he didn't recognize would appear outside his office watching. His mail was tampered with. Letters would arrive opened or wouldn't arrive at all. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves from him, worried about being associated with someone who'd made such powerful enemies. Father Antoine Blanc, who'd been one of Wickham's allies in the investigation, received a visit from the Archbishop of New Orleans, who strongly suggested that the priest should focus on his pastoral duties and leave legal matters to the civil authorities. The message was clear. The church didn't want to be involved in a controversy that might alienate wealthy parishioners. Dr. Henri Laveau, who'd examined the boxes and provided crucial medical testimony, found that some of his patients, particularly those from prominent families, were suddenly seeking care from other physicians. His income declined, and he began to worry about his ability to support his family. The pressure was working. Wickham's allies were being systematically isolated, their livelihoods threatened, their reputations attacked. The investigation was being strangled, not through legal means, but through social and economic pressure. Then, in late September, something happened that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. A fire broke out at the warehouse where the boxes were being stored. The fire started late at night when the warehouse was empty, and it spread quickly, fueled by the wooden crates and dry goods stored nearby. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, New Orleans didn't have a professional fire department in 1847. The warehouse was fully engulfed in flames. The firefighters managed to prevent the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings, but they couldn't save the warehouse itself. It burned to the ground, and everything inside was destroyed. The boxes were gone, all 22 of them, along with the hundreds of teeth they'd contained. The physical evidence that Dr. Laveau had so carefully cataloged, the tangible proof of the tooth extraction practice, destroyed. Only Jean-Baptiste's journal survived because Christophe Delacroix had kept it at his estate rather than turning it over to the authorities. The journal remained as evidence of what had happened, but without the boxes and the teeth, its impact was significantly diminished. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a lantern that had been knocked over by a worker. But Wickham didn't believe it. The timing was too convenient, the destruction too complete. He was convinced the fire had been set deliberately, that someone with a vested interest in keeping the tooth extraction practice secret had destroyed the evidence. He tried to continue his investigation without the physical evidence, relying on testimonies and documents. But without the boxes, his case lost much of its power. The teeth had been tangible proof of the practice's extent, a visceral reminder of the suffering inflicted. Without them, the story became easier to dismiss, to relegate to the realm of rumor and exaggeration. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. In October 1847, a man named Joseph Marchand approached Thomas Wickham with information that would expose the full truth about the tooth extraction practice and the network of enslavers who'd employed it. Marchand was a notary who'd worked in New Orleans for over 30 years. He'd handled property transactions, estate settlements, and other legal matters for many of the city's prominent families. He was in his early 62nd, and he'd built a reputation as a discreet and reliable professional who could be trusted with sensitive information. Marchand had been troubled by the discovery at the Delacroix estate and the subsequent fire that had destroyed the evidence. He'd known Jean-Baptiste Delacroix personally, had handled some of his legal affairs in the years before the old man's death. He'd also known other plantation owners who'd consulted with Jean-Baptiste about management techniques. At the time, Marchand had thought little of these consultations. They'd seemed like ordinary business discussions, the kind of thing that plantation owners did regularly as they sought to improve their operations and increase their profits. But in light of the tooth extraction revelations, Marchand had begun to review his old files with new eyes, and what he'd found had disturbed him deeply. Marchand had records of at least 15 plantation owners who'd corresponded with Jean-Baptiste Delacroix between 1795 and 1820. specifically asking about methods of psychological control. Some of the letters were explicit about the tooth extraction practice, discussing its implementation and effectiveness. Others used coded language, but the meaning was clear to anyone who knew what to look for. More significantly, Martian had records of payments made by these plantation owners to Dr. H.N. Russo, the physician who performed the tooth extractions. The payments were described as being for medical consultations, but the amounts were far too large for ordinary medical care. A typical doctor's visit in the early 1800s might cost $1 or $2. These payments ranged from $50 to $200, substantial sums that suggested something more than routine medical services. Marshall had always assumed these payments were for treating enslaved workers, perhaps for dealing with epidemics or injuries. But now he suspected something else. The payments had been for performing tooth extractions, for implementing the psychological control system that Jean-Baptiste had pioneered. Wickcham had investigated Dr. Russo's background and discovered that he died in 1825, leaving behind no family and few personal effects. But Wickham had been able to locate a former assistant of Russo's, a man named Claude Fontaine, who was still living in New Orleans and working as an apothecary. Fontaine was now in his 72nd, and he'd been reluctant to talk at first. He'd worked for Russo for nearly 15 years, from 1810 to 1825, and he'd been present for many of the tooth extractions, but he'd never spoken publicly about what he'd witnessed. Partly out of loyalty to his former employer, and partly out of fear of the powerful families who'd employed Russo's services, Wickham had persisted, visiting Fontaine multiple times, appealing to his conscience, arguing that the truth needed to be told. Finally, in late October, Fontaine had agreed to provide testimony about what he'd witnessed. Fontaine's account was chilling in its detail. He described Dr. Russo as a man without conscience, someone who saw enslaved people as objects rather than human beings. Russo had believed he was providing a valuable service, helping plantation owners maintain order and profitability. He developed a technique for extracting teeth quickly and with minimal tools. A pair of specialized pliers and a small chisel for loosening stubborn teeth. The extractions had been performed without any form of anesthetic. Russo had believed that the pain was part of the ritual's effectiveness, that the trauma of the extraction reinforced the psychological message that the enslaved person's body was not their own. Fontaine had witnessed hundreds of these extractions over his years working for Russo, and he'd seen the terror and suffering they caused. But Fontaine also revealed something that Jean-Baptiste's journal hadn't mentioned. The tooth extraction practice had eventually fallen out of favor, not because of moral concerns, but because it had become less effective. By the 1820s, many enslaved people had learned that the teeth held no real power, that the curse was a fiction designed to control them. The psychological hold had weakened as word spread among enslaved communities that people who'd escaped, despite having their teeth extracted, had not been mysteriously tracked down or struck by supernatural forces. The illusion had begun to crumble, and plantation owners had started looking for other methods of control. Jean-Baptiste's journal had ended in 1823, not because he'd stopped the practice voluntarily, but because it had stopped working. The enslaved people on his property had begun to resist more openly to test the limits of the supposed curse. When nothing supernatural happened, when escaped slaves weren't mysteriously returned or struck down by spiritual forces, the fear that had made the practice effective began to dissipate. This was why the elder Christophe had buried the boxes, not primarily out of moral horror, though Fontaine believed he'd been genuinely disturbed by his father's practices, but out of embarrassment. The tooth collection represented a failed experiment, a method of control that had ultimately proven ineffective. Keeping the boxes would have been a reminder of that failure, so they'd been hidden away, buried beneath the slave quarters where they'd be forgotten. Fontaine also provided names. He'd kept a record of the plantation owners who'd employed Russo's services, and he gave this list to Wickham. The list included some of the most prominent families in Louisiana, names that were still influential in 1847, families that held positions of power in the state government, the city council, and the business community. Wickham compiled all of this information: Martian's records, Fontaine's testimony, the surviving documents from the Delqua estate into a comprehensive report. He presented it to the city council in November 1847, demanding that the families implicated in the tooth extraction practice be held accountable. The report was detailed and damning. It documented not just what had happened at the Delacqua estate, but the broader network of psychological control that had existed throughout Louisiana. It named specific families, cited specific payments and correspondence, and provided testimony from people who'd witnessed or experienced the tooth extractions firsthand. Wickham argued that the tooth extraction practice represented a level of cruelty that demanded acknowledgement and accountability, even if the practice had ended decades earlier. The people who'd suffered under this system deserved to have their suffering recognized. The families who'd profited from this system needed to be held accountable, even if only through public acknowledgement of what they'd done. The response from the city council was swift and decisive. Nothing would be done. The council acknowledged that the tooth extraction practice had been regrettable and unfortunate, but they argued that it had taken place decades earlier under different social and legal circumstances. The plantation owners involved were either dead or elderly, and pursuing them would serve no purpose other than to create scandal and division. The council's decision was announced in a brief statement that was published in THE newspapers. The statement acknowledged the discovery of the boxes and the evidence of the tooth extraction practice, but it characterized the practice as an isolated aberration rather than a systematic form of control. The statement expressed sympathy for those who'd suffered under the practice, but it concluded that no further action would be taken. Wickham was furious. He'd spent months investigating, had risked his safety and reputation, had compiled overwhelming evidence of systematic cruelty, and the result was a complete dismissal. The suffering he documented was being swept under the rug, treated as an unfortunate but ultimately unimportant historical footnote. He decided to take his case to a broader audience. He published his complete report in a Boston abolitionist newspaper, hoping to generate national attention and pressure New Orleans authorities to act. The report was published in December 1847 under the headline, "The Teeth of Slavery, Psychological Torture in Louisiana." The report did generate attention, but not the kind Wickham had hoped for. Northern newspapers seized on the story as evidence of Southern barbarism, using it to fuel anti-slavery sentiment. Editorial writers described the tooth extraction practice as proof that slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but the enslavers, turning them into monsters capable of unimaginable cruelty. Southern newspapers responded by attacking Wickham and questioning the veracity of his claims. They characterized him as a Northern agitator, a liar trying to defame honorable Southern families. Some newspapers claimed that the tooth extraction practice had never existed, that the boxes had contained animal teeth or had been planted as part of an abolitionist conspiracy. The tooth extraction practice became a political weapon used by both sides in the increasingly bitter debate over slavery abolitionists' poi. And tied to it as evidence that slavery was inherently cruel and dehumanizing, slavery's defenders dismissed it as Northern propaganda, or when forced to acknowledge that something happened, characterized it as an isolated aberration that didn't reflect the broader reality of slavery. In New Orleans itself, the response was more muted. The families implicated in Wickham's report closed ranks, refusing to comment publicly. Some left the city temporarily, waiting for the scandal to blow over. Others hired lawyers and threatened to sue Wickham for defamation, though none of the lawsuits ever materialized, perhaps because a trial would have required them to testify under oath about their family's practices. Christophe Diacro became a pariah in New Orleans society. His family's role in pioneering the tooth extraction practice made them the focus of the scandal. Even though other families had been equally involved, the Delacqua children were ostracized at school, with other children refusing to play with them or sit near them. Margot's friends stopped calling, stopped inviting her to social events. The elaborate soirees that had once been highlights of the New Orleans social calendar came to an end. Christophe's position on the city council became untenable. He was subjected to hostile questions and accusations every time he attended a meeting. Other council members, many of whom had their own connections to families implicated in the tooth extraction practice, treated him with barely concealed contempt, not because they disapproved of what his grandfather had done, but because the discovery had brought unwanted attention to practices that were supposed to remain hidden. Christophe resigned from the city council in December 1847 and began making plans to leave New Orleans, the estate that had been in his family for over 50 years, the source of their wealth and social position, had become a burden he could no longer bear. The Delra family left New Orleans in February 1848, selling the estate to a cotton merchant from Mobile named William Harrison, who had no connection to the city's old Creole families. Harrison had made his fortune in the cotton trade and was looking to establish himself in New Orleans society. He'd bought the Delaquia estate at a significant discount, seeing it as an opportunity despite its troubled history. Harrison's first act as the new owner was to tear down the slave quarters entirely. He ordered the cabins demolished and the ground where they'd stood plowed under. He then built new structures for housing enslaved workers, placing them in a different location on the property away from the site where the boxes had been discovered. The demolition was thorough and deliberate. Harrison wanted to erase any physical reminder of what had happened on the property. He believed that by removing the structures associated with the tooth extraction practice, he could remove the stigma that attached itself to the estate, but erasing the physical evidence couldn't erase the memories or the historical record. The discovery of the boxes and the subsequent investigation had left a mark on New Orleans that would take years to fade. Thomas Wickham remained in New Orleans for another year, continuing to advocate for abolition and document the practices of slavery. But the tooth extraction scandal had exhausted him, and he'd made too many enemies among the city's elite. His legal practice suffered as potential clients avoided him, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd caused such controversy. In 1849, Wickham returned to Boston, where he continued his legal work and became involved in the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. He never forgot the tooth extraction investigation or the frustration of seeing overwhelming evidence of cruelty dismissed and ignored. Before leaving New Orleans, Wickham had one final meeting with Celeste Thibault, the woman whose testimony had been so crucial to understanding the tooth extraction practice. They'd met in Celeste's small shop in the French Quarter, and she'd thanked him for his efforts to bring the truth to light, even though those efforts had ultimately failed to achieve justice. Celeste had told Wickham that she didn't regret coming forward, despite the fact that nothing had changed. The truth had been told, she'd said, and that mattered even if the powerful people who'd benefited from the tooth extraction practice faced no consequences. The people who'd suffered under that practice had been acknowledged, their pain recognized, and that was worth something. Wickham had asked Celeste what had happened to her tooth, the one that Jean-Baptiste had extracted when she was 12 years old. She told him that she didn't know. It had presumably been in one of the boxes that had burned in the warehouse fire. Part of her, she'd admitted, was relieved that it was gone, that the physical object that had represented her bondage no longer existed. But another part of her felt a sense of loss. That tooth had been part of her, taken without her consent, and its destruction meant that even that small piece of her younger self was gone forever. It was a strange feeling, she'd said, to mourn the loss of something that had been used to control and torment her. The journal that had started everything, Jean-Baptiste Delacroix's meticulous record of tooth extractions, disappeared after Christophe left New Orleans. Christophe had taken it with him when the family relocated to Mobile, and its ultimate fate is unknown. Some historians believe it was destroyed, while others think it might still exist somewhere, hidden in a private collection or forgotten in an attic. Several attempts were made over the years to locate the journal. In the 1850s, an abolitionist historian tried to track it down, hoping to use it as evidence in the ongoing debate over slavery. In the 1870s, during Reconstruction, a federal investigator looking into civil rights violations in the South tried to find it, believing it might provide historical context for understanding the psychological mechanisms of slavery. But the journal was never found. If it still exists, it remains hidden, its location known only to descendants of the Delacroix family who've chosen to keep it secret. The tooth extraction practice itself faded from public memory remarkably quickly. By the 1850s, it was rarely mentioned, even in abolitionist literature. The practice had been too disturbing, too specific, too difficult to process. It was easier to focus on the more familiar brutalities of slavery, the whippings, the family separations, the forced labor, than to confront the psychological warfare that the tooth extractions represented. The Civil War came, and with it the end of slavery. In the chaos of war and Reconstruction, the tooth extraction scandal was forgotten, relegated to a footnote in the history of New Orleans. The families who'd been implicated in the practice either died out or successfully rehabilitated their reputations, presenting themselves as victims of Northern aggression rather than as perpetrators of psychological torture. But the practice left traces. In the decades after the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people began to tell their stories more openly, occasional references to tooth extractions appeared. These references were often brief and fragmentary, mentioned in passing as part of longer narratives about slavery's horrors. An interview conducted in 1937 as part of the Federal Writers Project included a brief mention by an elderly woman named Sarr Williams, who'd been enslaved in Louisiana. She described how her mother had told her about the tooth masters, plantation owners who'd taken teeth as a way of claiming souls. The interviewer had dismissed it as folklore, not realizing it was a reference to a real practice that had been documented nearly a century earlier. Modern historians examining the records of New Orleans plantations have found occasional references to dental procedures performed on enslaved people in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The references are vague, often just line items in financial records noting payments to physicians for unspecified services, but they align with the timeline of the tooth extraction practice, and they suggest that more evidence exists, buried in archives and private collections waiting to be discovered. The site of the Delacroix estate is now part of New Orleans' Garden District, one of the city's most beautiful and sought-after neighborhoods. The main house still stands, though it's been extensively renovated over the years and has changed hands many times. The current owners have no idea of the property's history, of the boxes that were buried beneath the slave quarters, or the psychological torture that was inflicted there. The area where the slave quarters once stood is now a garden with carefully tended flower beds and a small fountain. There's no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate what happened there. The history has been literally buried, covered over with soil and grass and ornamental plants. But sometimes when construction crews dig in the Garden District, when new foundations are laid, when water lines are replaced, when trees are planted, they find things, fragments of old buildings, pieces of pottery, remnants of lives lived long ago. And occasionally, very occasionally, they find small cloth bundles, rotted and barely recognizable, containing
Mething that might be a tooth.
These discoveries are rarely reported. The construction crews, the property owners, the city officials, they all have reasons to keep quiet. New Orleans is a city built on layers of history, and not all of those layers are comfortable to examine. The tooth extraction practice is just one of many dark secrets buried beneath the city's elegant facades. When such discoveries are made, the usual procedure is to quietly rebury whatever has been found and continue with the construction. No investigations are launched. No historical societies are notified. The past is allowed to remain buried literally and figuratively. Father Antoine Blanc, the priest who'd been one of the first to hear about the tooth extraction practice from Josephine, continued his ministry in New Orleans until his death in 1860. He never spoke publicly about what he'd learned, bound by the seal of confession and by his own complicated feelings about the church's relationship with slavery. But in his private journal, which was discovered after his death, Father Blanc had written extensively about the tooth extraction practice, and what it revealed about the nature of slavery. He'd struggled with the moral implications, with the question of how a supposedly Christian society could tolerate such cruelty, with his own complicity in a system that treated human beings as property. One entry from 1848 read, "The discovery at the Delqua estate has haunted me for months. I cannot stop thinking about those boxes, about the teeth they contained, about the suffering they represented. What kind of society have we built that such practices could exist not just in isolation, but as part of a network, a system? How many other horrors remain hidden, buried beneath our beautiful homes and our cultivated gardens? I fear that when the full truth of slavery is finally revealed, when all the secrets are brought to light, the weight of our collective guilt will be unbearable." Dr. Henri Laveau, who'd examined the boxes and provided crucial medical testimony, continued his medical practice in New Orleans. Though he never fully recovered the social standing he'd lost by participating in the investigation, he died in 1855, and his obituary made no mention of his role in the tooth extraction scandal, but Dr. Laveau had kept detailed notes from his examination of the boxes, and these notes survived him. They're now housed in the archives of a New Orleans medical school, where they provide a chilling record of the physical evidence that was destroyed in the warehouse fire. The notes describe each box, the number of teeth it contained, the condition of the teeth, and the evidence of trauma that many of them showed. One particularly disturbing note describes a tooth that appeared to have come from a child no more than 5 or 6 years old. The tooth showed evidence of having been extracted while the child was alive, and there were signs of infection in the root socket. Dr. Laveau had written, "What possible justification could there be for inflicting such suffering on a child? The cruelty documented in these boxes exceeds anything I have encountered in my medical practice. These are not the actions of civilized people, but of monsters who have lost all sense of human compassion." Celeste Thibault, the woman who testified about her experiences on the Delquire estate, lived until 1869. In her final years, she spoke occasionally about the tooth extraction and what it had meant to her and the other enslaved people who'd endured it. She described it as a theft, not just of a body part, but of dignity, of the right to believe that even in slavery, some part of yourself remained your own. The tooth extraction had been a violation that went beyond the physical, a way of claiming owners, hip not just of labor, but of identity, of spirit, of the very essence of a person. The psychological impact of the practice, she said, had lasted far longer than the physical pain of the extraction. Even after she'd been freed, even after she'd built a successful life for herself, she'd sometimes wake in the night thinking about her tooth, wondering where it was, whether it had been destroyed in the fire or whether it still existed somewhere, a fragment of her younger self held captive in a box. That sense of incompleteness, of having something essential taken and never returned, was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the tooth extraction practice. It was a violation that couldn't be undone, a wound that couldn't heal because the thing that had been taken could never be restored. Celeste died in her sleep in 1869 at the age of about 90. She was buried in St. Louis Cemetery Numbers 2 in a tomb that she'd purchased years earlier with money she'd saved from her seamstress work. Her tombstone bore a simple inscription: Celeste Thibault, 1779-1869, free at last. The discovery of the boxes in 1847 had briefly brought the tooth extraction practice to light, had forced New Orleans society to confront one of the mechanisms by which slavery had been maintained. But the confrontation had been incomplete. The reckoning deferred, the boxes were destroyed, the families implicated faced no real consequences, and the practice faded back into obscurity. What remains is a question that historians still grapple with. How many other practices like this existed? How many other methods of psychological control of spiritual violation were employed by enslavers and then forgotten or deliberately hidden? The tooth extractions were documented because of Jean-Baptiste Decqua's compulsive record-keeping and the accidental discovery of the boxes during a routine renovation. But how many similar practices left? No records, no physical evidence, nothing but fading memories and occasional fragments of testimony? The story of the Delacroix estate and the buried boxes is a reminder that the history of slavery encompasses not just the brutalities that were openly acknowledged, but also the hidden cruelties, the calculated psychological tortures that were designed to break spirits as well as bodies. Understanding that history requires looking beneath the surface, digging into the uncomfortable truths that were buried alongside the boxes of teeth. It requires acknowledging that slavery was not just an economic system, but a comprehensive assault on human dignity that employed every tool available, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Just when we thought we'd uncovered everything about the Delacroix estate, the horror in New Orleans reveals itself to be even deeper than imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other secrets history has buried. The tooth extraction practice stands as a testament to the ingenuity of cruelty, to the ways that power can be exercised not just through force, but through the manipulation of belief and the violation of spiritual integrity. It's a story that challenges us to think about slavery not just as a system of labor exploitation, but as a comprehensive assault on human dignity that employed every tool available, physical, psychological, and spiritual. The boxes uncovered in 1847 held human teeth, but they stood for something far more profound. They were evidence of an effort to assert ownership not only over bodies, but over identity itself, an attempt to convince human beings that even their spirit could be taken from them. In the end, that effort failed. The enslaved people on the Delacroix estate and on neighboring plantations came to understand the ritual for what it truly was, and in recognizing the deception, began to resist it. Still, the attempt matters. The pain it caused matters. Those who endured the extractions, who lived under the psychological weight of believing a piece of themselves was being held hostage, deserve to be remembered. Their experiences deserve to be named, not erased. Although the practice faded from public memory, its legacy did not disappear. It stands as a stark reminder that the most ruthless forms of oppression do not stop at physical suffering. They reach into the mind and spirit, seeking to control not just actions but beliefs, what people are taught to think about their own worth and humanity. This mystery reveals how the darkest chapters of history are often the ones most carefully concealed, buried beneath silence, influence, and denial. The discovery of the boxes in 1847 briefly lifted the veil on one such chapter, but it was quickly lowered again, and the truth was pushed back into the shadows. So what do you think? Was everything truly uncovered, or are parts of this story still hidden? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, where history and horror quietly intersect, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who loves unraveling dark mysteries. I'll see you in the next one.